Special treat to be here with you in Unity, and always generous thanks to Carolyn for making it happen. Without Carolyn, we wouldn't be here. And over the years, we've become good friends. She's always serving others, and it's her work to make sure that we all have a good experience. And so, thank you again for everything you do, Carolyn.
Oh, thank you.
Every January when I come, I make the same sales pitch. And I'm going to make it again today. If you have never been to the famous Boar's Head Festival at TCU, the first Sunday in January, guess what this is? The first Sunday in January. Always free of charge, always free parking, always incredible. They hold it over the Epiphany weekend, which is this weekend, and I was there yesterday at 3 p.m. and I'll be there again today at 3 p.m. You cannot, I've tried and tried to explain it to people, but you have to see it. You have to experience it, understand what an extraordinary event it is. Just to give you an analogy, many years ago, about 20 years ago, I had taken a group out to the Rose Bowl parade. Over the years, I've done lots of trips all over the world, and I used to do this because there's only one parade, the Rose Bowl. Every other parade is, might as well be a neighborhood parade. The Rose Bowl parade is a parade, beyond normal human experience. Each float being itself kind of a museum of great interest, and there's no float in there that isn't cost more than $1 million, $2 million, $3 million.
Oh my.
And they have hundreds of them. Breathtaking. But anyway, we always go out to the Rose Bowl, and so I've been there many times. Well, one year we said, let's do some other things here, and Robert Schuller, the famous preacher in Orange County, had built the Crystal Cathedral. I wanted to see the Crystal Cathedral. That's my main reason for going, to see it. But they were going to have their famous Christmas show. And they put on many nights, tens of thousands of people. You have to have reservations, all this. And they have one of these fantastic shows where they have special effects, right? The big one is angels flying everywhere, and how they pull that off is really quite Disney-esque, I would say. And they have Santa Claus is parachuting out of the ceiling, and just go on and on. And I was really entertained, and it was exciting to see. And I was glad I saw it. But when it was over, I said, well, I've seen that. I'm happy I saw it, but don't need to see it again. In other words, it didn't move me deeply. Well, we came back from California. The next weekend was the Boar's Head, and there was somebody in it that we were related to, and a girl of about age 9. And my wife told me, we need to go to the Boar's Head and see Faith. Sure, I'm happy to go. What is the Boar's Head? I don't know anything about the Boar's Head. Well, I don't either. We'll go. It may not be that good, but so we got there, and when it opens, lights go down, and all you can hear is this thud, thud, thud sound, like an army is coming at you. And I'm not going to tell you what that is, because I want you to go and see it yourself. But I was mesmerized from there on, every little smallest detail of it. And when it was over, I stood up in the pew, and I started kicking the pew. And my wife said to me, "What's wrong? Have you gone nuts?" I said, "I am so mad. said, why are you mad? They've been doing this for 30 years and I wasn't here. Right? And I'm never going to miss it again. Well, it's really been tough the last 2 years. They didn't have it, right? So I was so happy to go back, and it was just as wonderful. I've seen it over and over and over and over again. I'll see it. I saw it yesterday. I'll see it today. But it just will move you.
Tell everybody where it is.
I will. So, some of you have now heard of this school called Texas Christian University because it's in the national championship. By the way, they had 10,000 new applications to go to TCU just because they went on the national stage.
Wow.
Nobody ever heard of TCU, right? Now TCU is like a deal. So, you know, as much as football has its problems, it does do a few things. And the money started flowing into TCU. And it's unusual because normally the big bowl games and nowadays the playoffs are always state schools, universities. For a private school to make it. The only other one I know that regularly does is Notre Dame, right? So this is not a common thing. Well, anyway, so you go to, if you know anything about Fort Worth, you go to University Drive. Like let's say you're going to the zoo. You get off Interstate 30 and drive south past the zoo, up the hill about a mile, and on the right-hand side, just as you come to the corner of TCU, there is University Christian Church that has the Boar's Head Festival. This is the 47th year they've run it. And this is extraordinary at many levels. 99% of the churches that have Boar's Head festivals are Church of England, Episcopalian. Here you have this Disciples of Christ. They have no tradition of doing this kind of thing. And they just decided they wanted to do their own board head. They hired a student, a graduate student at TCU, paid him $3,500, 45, 47, 48, 9 years ago, to write the boar's head up, based on what the boar's head is traditionally in England. What it is, it's a medieval pageant, but it starts out with the boar head festival, which they call the Yule, Y-U-L-E, which even today in Scandinavia is still the word for Christmas, because predating Christianity, the boar's head festival was their honoring of their gods. And the boar was the totem, and they would mount the boar's head after, and then they would feast on the boar's body. Always a fascinating concept that you consume the body. It was very, very similar to, say, the Lakota Sioux Indians and some of those that worship the buffalo, and yet they eat the buffalo, yet they honor the buffalo. It's that kind of thing. Well, anyway, these Germanic people were being Christianized, and they were they were really pretty happy to accept Christianity. But this is true of all people. They don't want to give up their holy days, their holidays, their times of festival, because it's very, very important to them. Well, the Christian came along and said, "Well, it's fine. You can have your boar's head. We'll continue the celebration, but we'll reinterpret it." And so the pageant is a reinterpretation, as it were, of what happened. The beginning of this pageant is all about the pagan festival, the pagan medieval festival, as it would have been going on, say, year 1000 in England. And because remember, England is all Germanic people until 1066. See? And so you have it's all German traditions. So because of that, then they and then Christianity comes in, and then kind of a short nativity story, and leading up to a grand finale, which will blow your eyes out. I promise you. Now, you've been there, have you?
Several times.
Have I exaggerated very much?
Not a bit.
See, I'm terrible at exaggeration.
Not
I
a bit.
try to keep it down. Anybody else?
You've got, haven't you?
Carolyn, you haven't been yet, have you?
I haven't been yet.
No, I've been
Still
after.
today, 3 and 5.
Yeah, so anyway, there's no reason for you not to go if you have the time this afternoon. It starts at 3 and then they do it again at 5. If you want a seat, now the seat thing, the seats are free except for people who have wanted to sit up front, and so they paid to have tickets. But in my opinion, it's unnecessary because the thing is movie, so you'll see it. No matter where you're sitting, you're going to see every character that's in the whole thing. Costumes, well, Hollywood never had costumes like that. It's amazing. They have women who do nothing but prepare these costumes each year over and over again. And so it's just a delight. So it's a deeply spiritual, but it's also artistically speaking, culturally speaking, it's very significant. And people, some people go and go every year. Some people go and enjoy it, and they then pass it on to other people to go. So I'm forever meeting people over there that I sent many years ago, and then they come again, and some in the past from this class. So we will. Some of us will be there today. Maybe if you have time. I don't know. People have important things to do, but Sunday afternoon, first week in January, is usually a quiet time. And so I'm sorry to take so much time on that, Carolyn, but it's important in the sense that it might, might impact you. It might have an impact in your life. Now, this was supposed to be a program originally on how the Friars came to be. But as I got into it, I realized the Friars make no sense at all unless you understand monasticism. And so I'm going to spend today, and part of next time, building the foundation so we can finally get to the Friars. Now, you may have seen, if you saw any publicity on this, the cliffhanger. The cliffhanger is what two men changed the course of history who were friars. And that does not include St. Francis of Assisi. Although he did, St. Francis is one of those pivotal people in the history of the world who changed so much because, in my opinion, it's through Francis that you start to see the first light of the Reformation. And the Reformation, in fact, is directly, as you'll find out of the work of the Friars. But I want to build the foundation, and I hope you can come to all four, possibly, because it's a little bit hard if you come in to say the third one to understand exactly how it all fits together. But if you have to miss, you have to miss. That's just the way it goes. So I want to start with early Christian church. Now, in the early Christian church, there were men, primarily, a few women, not very many, mostly men, who felt the church had been contaminated by the Emperor Constantine. Now you say, well, how so? He's the one that brought in the church and eliminated the competition. And it isn't very long after Constantine that you have the Christian church being the official church of the Roman Empire. And boy, that's a trick. to become, given the fact they had so many religions under the umbrella, what we call the Roman religion, to boil all that down into one religion. That's an extraordinary event in history. But what you have to appreciate with this period of time, particularly when the Edict of Milan came along, which after Constantine, during Constantine's time, which gave freedom of religion. But Constantine wanted freedom of religion so that Christians wouldn't be persecuted. Now, this is really weird if you understand that Constantine was not a Christian. Now, why would a man spend so much time, energy in support of an institution that he wasn't part of? The answer is his mother. Now, when I was in Europe on one of my many tours, they were talking in Italy about this concept of mamzers. Mamzers. I said, what's a mamzer? They said, well, a mamzer is a young man who grows up but never really matures and doesn't want to leave mom. Mom is the center of the universe for that young man. Particularly if he's an only son. Particularly if there's no father in the picture. Well, this is exactly the situation with Constantine. His mother, Helena, the dad's not around. And he and his mother are an item. They're totally together. And Constantine is one of these enigmas in history. Why he was so totally devoted to his mother. But he was, and whatever mother wanted, mother got. And mother was a Christian. This thing. Constantine was raised, to be a Roman, follow the Roman religion. And he was very devoted to the Roman religion until his mother became Christian. Then he started easing out of it. And when he became the emperor, he had the power. Now, to be a Roman emperor, you talk about power. Here's a man who calls all the shots in this vast, the Roman Empire, from way up Hadrian's Wall up in Scotland, all the way to the Tigris and Euphrates, south into Africa, Egypt, north into Germany, and this is massive place, and you have one guy makes all the decisions and has to ask nobody. So if Constantine wants to spend money, he doesn't have to say, they need a bridge over here. Should we? He doesn't ask anybody. He might ask for advice maybe, but he makes the decision. And he goes to the treasury and gets the money. That's power. The Romans, by the way, got into enormous, during the Empire period, they got into enormous trade with India. And it's so funny that it was such big news when Vasco da Gama had traveled from Portugal, took him forever, come around Africa and go to India and land in India. And when he got there, he met Jewish traders that had already been there 1,200 years. Unbelievable, right? That there were communities, Jewish and also Assyrian traders who had traveled and established community. So before the time of Christ, you could go to a synagogue in India along the Spice Coast. And they were very, very big into the spice trade. Now, So back to Constantine. So Constantine, making it sure that the Christians were not persecuted. He, by the way, Constantine did not become a Christian till on his deathbed. Right? So on his deathbed, you know, who knows what happened. Did he willingly go, or did they say, do you want to be baptized? And he mumbled something and they baptized. I mean, who knows, right? This is, always seemed to me that in history he's portrayed as a Christian. I'm not sure that's really true, but whatever his mother wanted. By the way, if you go to Bethlehem, when you go, have you been to Bethlehem or Jerusalem? Mm-hmm. You know, the Church of the Nativity. This is built by Helena, right? The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where all those religious groups fight to get in their time, you know, in the precious temple. Helena, built all that. And it goes on, you go around Israel and you'll find Helena's handiwork, you might say. Now, because all of a sudden of the edict, and then a few years later, Christianity becoming the official religion, you have these people, these men, they're basically hermits, who decide that Christianity has now been contaminated. Because everybody becomes Christian. See, the old principle was, whatever the ruler is what everybody is. And this was true in the Romans. So if a Roman emperor was a Christian, then everybody's Christian, by default. You're born into it. This idea of freedom of religion did not exist. And yet, having said that, the Romans were very tolerant of other religions, particular religions from the East, called mystery religions. And one of those mystery religions eventually took over. And that mystery religion we know today as Christianity. See? And it's that kind of evolution, you might say, of how Christianity came to be the one and only religion that's so extraordinary for the Romans, because the Romans were always, sure, come on in. You can go to Rome and see the ruins of all kinds of gods and deities that were not Roman. You know, Mithraism, right? The cult of Cybele. All of these religions were welcomed by the Romans until Christianity. And then all of a sudden, kaboom, they're all gone. They're all literally obliterated. And it's that obliteration that is so hard to really understand how a country, a culture, could make that big a change. And so the remnants of many of those religions are co-opted into Christian holy days. And I did a series here, it was my last series, Carolyn, on Christian holy days, and how so many of them are ancient pagan festivals that were reworked. And that's exactly what happened with the boar's head. So the boar's head was continued for centuries and centuries, and was such a tradition that then some people just kept doing it. But they did it. They turned the boar into the devil, and I mean, they did some things to make the boar evil, but the idea, nobody ever asked the question, what's the boar doing here? You know? And the answer is, it was part and parcel of the ancient Germanic religion. Now, so these men said, I'm having none of this. I want to practice the true Christianity. And so they're hermits. And so what they would do is they would go out into the forest, look for a little cave. They go out into the desert, look for a little spot where they could carry on, if they could find a little water somewhere. And there were thousands of these men that abandoned their domestic lives and went out and lived by themselves. Now, hermits still exist to this day, but there's always been a small, isolated group because it's very difficult for a person to survive on their own for very long. Now, what these men were doing is trying to practice the true Christianity. In other words, to try to be truly holy. And there's a formula in this that I want to write down. The idea that suffering equals holiness. Now, this is the point that we get into with these men. What they would do is spend their days in self-mortification. Now, this word mortification, the key Roman root here is mort, means death, right? So, for example, mortician is a physician to the dead. Mortuary, the temple of the dead, right? My favorite mort word is this one, mortify. So, two girls show up at prom, best friends, and they're just so happy, you know, new dress, beautiful flower, lovely escort, you know, they're just in hog heaven, they're getting ready to be introduced, which is what in the prom. By the way, the word prom is short for promenade. You know, you'd march around, and then you eventually come your turn, and then you'd be announced. And promenade was very big, by the way. You can go to Mexico, to an old colonial town down there, and you'll find the promenade. See, where downtown, they would have an area where the families would come and bring their daughters, and their daughters would march around to be introduced, and the men would all line up around, you know, look at them, because now they were up for grabs, right? The best bidder. But anyway, prom is something, you know, traditions that people love die really hard. And I remember in the 80s or 90s, there was this whole tradition in high school. You know, prom, that's old school. We don't do that. We don't do that. That's too archaic, right? But prom survived. Why? Because people love proms, right? This is the point. Promenading. And so these two girls, they arrived, they're best friends, they're just getting ready to promenade, they come together, and they're wearing exactly the same dress. And the one girl says to her boyfriend, "Oh my God, I'm mortified." I'm mortified. In other words, I'd rather be dead than go through this embarrassment, right? And I have to tell you this because it relates so well. Yesterday, I was sitting near a young girl, about, you know, maybe 14, and she was mortified, and I could see she was very unhappy. I know her, she's the daughter of a family. I know. I could see that she was very unhappy. So I said, "What's wrong?" She said, "I'm just mortified." I said, "Why?" She said, "I didn't know this was in a church." So she wears, you know how they wear these jeans? That, in this case, you know, the whole front was torn out. This is this year's version of, you know, the beat-up jeans, which started back in the 1980s with the grunge movement. One of the few cultural movements that never left. People love so much dress. You know, the whole point of the grunge movement is dressing down, right? The lower you would try to just be as basic as you could possibly be. It came out of Seattle, and if you've ever endured Seattle winter, you know what I'm talking about, right? It's brutal. That's why coffee is so big there. And anyway, so she was I'm mortified. I said, "Why?" I didn't know this was going to be, you know, such, you know, because people are kind of dressed up. It ruined the whole thing for her. Oh. She couldn't think about anything. She couldn't see the beauty going around her. She couldn't really enjoy it all because she was so wrapped up into her own thing, see. this is what we all do. We all get wrapped up into our own thing, right? And we don't see things clearly because we just see it from our little teeny narrow point of view, right? Well, anyway, these hermits were, in some cases, extraordinary individuals. And I want to tell you just about two of them because, boy, the time goes, Carolyn. I don't know. It's really tough getting out anything because I have so many rabbit holes I go down.
That's why we had you for 4 weeks.
Yeah, that's why you needed 4 months, but you didn't have that.
We're game if you are.
Thank you. All right, I want to tell you about St. Anthony. Now, St. Anthony is a hermit in Egypt in the 4th century. In the 3rd century into the 4th century. St. Anthony was one of these guys who felt the church is being totally contaminated, and so he's searching. His goal is to find this particular other hermit that he's heard about named Paul, who is down there in near Luxor, in Thebes, down in central Egypt. And he wants to go him and learn. He does eventually find him, but in the meantime, he goes and spends all this 20 years being a hermit practicing self-mortification. Well, what do you do when you self-mortify? The main thing they would do is they would take a handle called a flagel in Latin, and this handle, then they'd put nine pieces of leather, attach it, and then at the end of each piece of leather there would be a piece of glass, a sharp piece of metal, and they'd whip themselves every day until they just bled, constantly. And they did this voluntarily because they suffered, incredibly, right? Martin Luther complained. He said, I had my flagel, and I used it. This, by the way, what this is usually called in English is cat of nine tails. Cat of nine tails. He said, I felt so bad because I had all these evil thoughts. And I used the cat of nine tails. And I didn't feel any better after it was over. I still had all these evil thoughts. Yeah, Luther, he's pretty blunt. And if you ever read Luther, you'd like in shock because he's so blunt. But he's also self-revealing, which is unusual. That a person tells it the way it really is with him. And now, one of the biggest mistakes I made in my entire career, and I've made some little, saying things that aren't true. And for 20, 30 years, I would say, Martin Luther was a monk. And I had gotten confused because even Luther called himself a monk. Luther was not a monk. Luther was a friar. Which explained, the one day it dawned on me, so if Luther's a monk, how come he's teaching at a university? Monks don't do that. Monks stay put. And then it occurred to me, he can't be a monk. So then one thing led to another, and I finally realized he's not a monk. People call him a monk. He called himself a monk. He wasn't a monk. He was a friar. And it's like a big difference, It's like calling a basketball player a football player. I mean, it's just like a different ball game, totally. But anyway, St. Anthony then spent all this time, And he was suffered greatly from demons who would come and tempt him with all kinds of wonderful things. Demons. Now these are spiritual beings that have taken over bodies, other bodies. They have taken over bodies for the purpose of subverting people, Satan. So the demon is in the form, might even be in the form of a holy person, right? Or a priest, or a king, or a peasant. But the demon is coming to subvert you. And so these demons would come and they would tempt him endlessly. And he would reject the tempting, and his suffering was monumental. Monumental. And so because of this, he became famous as one of the holiest of men. One thing that he was afflicted with is now called St. Anthony's fire. Now, this is a weird disease. It's caused by people that would eat rye. You know, rye bread, right? But it would get tainted with a fungus called ergot. E-R-G-O-T, ergot. And this fungus, ergot, would then contaminate to the point that people would get so sick, the gangrene would develop in their hands and their feet, right? Or they would really go mad, mentally out of control. And this is called St. Anthony's fire. Well, St. Anthony's fire descended on him, and he survived it somehow. And so he then became the great saint for people to go to when they had St. Anthony's fire. St. Anthony's fire was all through the Middle Ages. Whole communities would die from it because it was so powerful, a fungus. And they would all have the common bakery and all eat the bread that had rye in it, and boom, they were in terrible shape. So he became the patron saint of those who had that disease. Also, he's patron saint of beggars and so on. Now, I want you to do something for me if you have a chance, and I am watching. I'm sorry. I want you to, you want to see something that will really bring this home to you. I want you to go down to the Meadows Museum at Southern Methodist University. Go up into the gallery, and they have retablos. Retablo is an altar piece. In English, it might be called a, what's the word? I had the word on the tip of my tongue. A retablo is an altar piece that you look at for inspiration, right? Well, they have two incredible retablos from Spain that show the life of St. Anthony. And you'll see these demonic people coming and testing him. What's amazing is that they're dressed up like normal medieval people, and in fact, even royalty. But their feet, they have chicken feet or duck's feet, right? And then this, it turns out, is a facade. If you take all the facade off, you'll see they have some of these beings in their normal attire. And you know what they look like? They look like what we think aliens look like, right? And they have, and I think this is the source of our kind of idea, our vision of aliens. Starts back then.
How old are the retablos?
These retablos are from the Middle Ages, probably the 12th, 13th, 14th century. By the way, you know, I don't know if you ever thought about this. How did it come to pass that Dallas, Texas has the second most important Spanish art museum in the world. How did that happen? Well, because of a family named the Meadows. You've heard of lots of Meadows money spread around Dallas. They redid that whole area down by Baylor, Swiss Avenue. They completely redid that. And I'm no telling what cost. But there's the Meadows School of Music, Meadows School of the Arts, all of this kind of stuff.
Maybe the demons were really aliens.
Yeah, well, in a way that's very true, because our concept of aliens and their concept of demons are very, very similar in a way. To be feared and not necessarily coming to do good things for us and all of that. But what's interesting, this is just an aside, but it's kind of interesting. The most famous museum in Spain, and in my opinion, I haven't been to a lot of museums, but I've been, to the Great Metropolitan, I've been to the Louvre, I've been to a number of the fine museums of the world, but in my opinion, the best museum in the world, better than that one in Florence, Jim, the Uffizi, the Prado. Oh my God, what a museum it is. All Spanish art, or mostly Spanish art, but anyway, you know what the word meadow is in Spanish? Prado. What a coincidence. Very strange, very strange. The Meadows went over there to look for oil in Spain and loved the country so much they started living there and collecting art. And of course, this story, this same kind of story happens over and over in Dallas history. A family, they get very, very rich, they become benefactors, they collect art. That art goes, Dallas Museum of Art, loaded with stuff like that. Because of the wealth of Dallas, we have all this amazing art. But anyway, if you go and look at those two huge, they're massive, right? They were up in a cathedral in Spain somewhere. And if you look at those, you will be, I think, quite surprised and amazed to see that. All right, now St. Anthony then is a guy who spent most of his time as a hermit, but then he decides that he wants to teach others, lead others, help others, and he forms the first collective group of hermits, and it's the name we need to talk about, cenobites. Oh, I forgot to tell you an important thing. These hermits are called anchorites. And the reason they're called anchorites is because they're anchored in one spot. Out in the desert, the anchorites. Well, what St. Anthony did is bring anchorites together in a little community, created the first cenobites. The name evolves into the word monastic, see? Monastery. Now, we think of a monastery as a group of people together, but they don't think of it that way. What the hermits did, what they thought the cenobites were all about, people still lived individually in these little cells, right? And they lived in these cells, and they would come together occasionally, for prayer and so on. But primarily the life was spent in isolation. See, and that's a very important detail in understanding the evolution of monasticism. Oh, by the way, I want to show you something, and then I'll have to call it quits here, Carolyn. So let's say this is a monastic church, okay, somewhere. What they did is they would often create a cell along the wall of the church, all along the wall of the church. Maybe just, maybe not more than 10 feet. they would build a little hut here, made of brick, no door. So they put the hermit inside here, and then he would be in there, and they'd brick it up, no exit. Then they'd cut a little hole here, so he could look through and see Mass. That way, he would have access to the benefits of Mass, and the priest would come and hand him away and he would participate in communion. So he was part of the community, but he was totally isolated, right? This is an example of how extreme these people went. They're part of the community, but just through this little slit, right? I mean, this is in essence. If you go over, anybody been to the Chalced Carmelite nuns in Arlington? There's a Carmelite convent over there. And you can go, I mean, you can go today if you want to. You go over there and they have Mass. And you go in and it's normal, looks like a normal church except one side. This side here is all bars, just like a prison. And decalcid meant no shoes, without shoes. And those women are over there, without shoes, living in isolation. They can participate in Mass and see it and sing and so on, but they are separated. And the only way between those two, they have a little turnaround where, like, you want to leave something for the nuns, you know, a gift, maybe some food, maybe some flowers, you know, they can put it in there. So there are people that do this to this day. These lives of isolation. The Trappists are famous because, you know what they have to give up? Talking, speech. That lasts about 2 minutes as a Trappist. I don't know, just, all of a sudden I've got to say something, you couldn't say it. And yet there are Trappists. Thomas Merton is the most famous American Trappist up in Kentucky. But these men and women, the women did it too. We'll talk about that a little bit later when we get to St. Francis. But the men are primarily the ones who do the most severe mortifications. I mean, how much more you can't talk, right? You have to speech yourself. You have to go through all this mortification. Oh, one more quick story. So I had a nun one time from the Holy Family of Nazareth convent in Grand Prairie. And I actually had several number of sisters over the years. And so we became, you know, she was very talkative and everything. So one day in class I asked her, do you have a whip for mortification? She said, of course. Oh, really? Well, would you mind bringing it to class? You know, show and tell. So she said, yeah, I'll bring it. Okay, so in that next class period, did you bring the bread? Well, no. How come? Well, the Mother Superior heard about it. She went ballistic. No way. No way. She said, however, we have a little museum down in the county. You can come down and see it. It's just one of the, you know, things that we have there for people to see, you know, the life of a nun. Right? Now, nowadays, you know, nuns live very, you know, from hardly any recognizable life in the convent to, you know, this very severe restricted life. And everything in between. Same with the monks. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about the monks next week, and then we're going to also get into, start to get into how the friars came about. That is an amazing, almost unbelievable story. So I hope you are able to come to some or all of those. Does anybody here have a question before we call it quits? Yes, sir.
I have heard since I was a kid about the Friars. I had spoken here in September.
Yeah.
Phyllis Tickle's book, and about the monasticism, and there was this word anchorites I'd never seen. I had to look it up, and it was describing them. But the question I wondered since I was a child, I've heard taught, were they attempting to emulate the life of John the Baptist in doing this?
And the life of Jesus, because the Jesus passion, they're just reenacting Jesus' passion over and over and over again.
But not specifically the 40 days and nights in the desert, in the wilderness, but...
Yeah, that's correct. They, not specifically, although they would do that too. I mean, there were individuals that did that sort of thing. Go into the desert 4 days, come back out, fasting and all that. But that was not wired into any of the rules of any of these orders. The thing about being a hermit, you can do what you want to. See, the thing, as soon as you get into monasticism, you get into rules and regulations.
Oh, okay, so they were just being,
Yeah.
they were being more individualistic.
Yeah, and also maybe more in the spirit of what Jesus endured. Though in the medieval period, we'll talk about this.
Okay.
You have these men, we call them the whipping boys, during the Black Death. So they had this idea. The reason Black Death descended on Europe is because people were so evil. So what their idea was to bring holiness, and their idea of holiness was to whip themselves. So they gathered together in communities, and they would go from village to village. And they come into a village, and they'd whip themselves until the blood just ran down the streets.
Oh, wow.
And they did this, are you ready? 33 and a half days was your commitment to do that. In other words, you didn't have to be a holy man to do this. You could be a baker somewhere. But you just would give up 33 and a half days and become one of these whipping guys. And they would do this over and over. And it was, you talk about bringing in the crowds. I mean, people came far and wide to see this. And they whipped themselves. They also whipped each other. And they eventually started doing, as part of this, they come into a community, they had the audience, they started telling, remember this is before literacy, most people are illiterate, so they would start performing these little plays called morality plays.
Oh, wow.
And that's how, that's when the idea of drama returns to Western civilization is during the Middle Ages. So there's a lot to that. That's a huge, interesting subject in itself. Thank you all. Oh, Jim, quick.
A quick comment, getting back to ergot,
Yeah.
that's also a hallucinogen.
Yes.
And the visualizing demons and so forth,
Yes.
a lot of people think that that's where a lot of the
Love that
demonology
came from. Yeah.
part of it.
That's a great point, Jim. Thank you. Yes. Go on.
Okay, we're done.
Okay.
We're done.
Thank you all.
Thank you.